Welcome to the Artificial Intelligence Precision Health Institute Affinity talk series. And here we hear from leaders of the field and discuss trends on AI in healthcare and bring together researchers in a variety of fields with clinicians and advocates to solve problems that really were not even solvable a decade ago before the broad use of deep learning in medicine. The talk format is roughly about 30 to 40 minutes, and we encourage everybody to ask questions and interact during the question time. It's also great if you leave your camera on during the talk because it's more real to the speaker and to the rest of us that with the reactions and more like an in-person talk. The talk series is sponsored by the University of Hawaii Cancer Center in Kaka'ako, Honolulu, and also by the well, I was going to say we have a website that you can go to and for the Artificial Intelligence Precision Health Institute, which is part of the Cancer Center and the campus in a larger way, and it's found at the website listed here. Also sponsored by the Hawaii Data Science Institute, which trains our students in the use of deep learning in a variety of topics, including medicine. We have generous speaker compensations, which include a beer stein with our logo on it. And we like people to send us a picture of their stein so we can use it to attract other speakers. And our paper of the month is by Dr. McCradden. It's called CANAIRI, and if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Collaboration for Translational Artificial Intelligence Trials in Healthcare. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Melissa McCradden. Melissa is an associate professor, bioethicist, and clinical researcher at Adelaide University in Australia. She serves as the Artificial Intelligence Director and Deputy Research Director with the Women's and Children's Health Network, and a Deputy Director and the Hospital Research Foundation Group Fellow at the Australian Institute for Machine Learning. She is an adjunct scientist with the Sick Kids Research Institute and a member of the Sick Kid Research Ethics Board in Toronto. Dr. McCradden also has an expertise in the development of ethical frameworks derived from clinical and technical knowledge grounded by policy, law, and moral theory. So welcome, Melissa, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for having me. It's very exciting to be presenting to you from my home here in Adelaide. Hope you can see the screen or the slides now. Perfect. All right, thank you. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land that I'm speaking to you from today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, always was, always will be. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and connection to the land, to country, and honor their spiritual beliefs. I'd also like to particularly acknowledge my colleagues in the Aboriginal Health Unit at Women's and Children's Hospital, who have been really instrumental to me ever since the first day that I arrived here in Australia. So I'll be talking today about this concept of silent trials, which is a newer idea in the mainstream literature, but it's actually a tool that many folks have been using for a while to facilitate AI translation. And I'll talk about how that's led us to Project CANAIRI and what our goals are. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the results we're finding from our scoping review study, which explores the literature that's published around silent trial projects. So, one of the main messages that I think is really important about this space is that with all of the promises around AI, we're seeing variable adoption, variable return on investment. And so there's still this field of uncertainty. We know now that under particular circumstances, AI tools can improve things like prioritization within workflows. They can provide clinically meaningful alerts to support patient care. They can introduce efficiencies in care management and mobilize resources based on patient need. However, recent systematic reviews showed that only 3/5 show net benefit. And in fact, this morning, there was a systematic review published of AI in radiology where they found that only 1% actually showed economic benefits, which is a pretty striking statistic. We still know that model failures are widespread. Many folks will be familiar with the case of Epic's sepsis model. And so this challenge of internal generalizability remains a really big one. We need to figure out things like local suitability and utility to actually help us look at things like cost efficiency. And we also need to look at how we actually generate benefit to patients and healthcare systems. Even well-validated models are often not translated into practice with the information that clinicians are actually really looking for to help them use them appropriately and ethically. And this is really important because clinicians are what are called learned intermediaries. So the manufacturer has obligations, the healthcare system has some obligations, but ultimately the liability tends to fall on the physician who's using the tool. Professional guidance says the clinician needs to know everything that they need to know in order to use it with responsibility. And so this results in this concept that's been called a moral crumple zone. Now, there was this really great paper done by Deborah Raji and colleagues, who many folks might be familiar with, where they looked at 282 cases of AI use, so actual real world use, not specific to healthcare. And what they found was that there were a number of ways in which these AI tools could fail, even though they showed promising performance in terms of AUC and accuracy. And one of the things that they noticed is that there's this persistent belief in the functionality, which rests on the technical performance alone. So we tend to believe that models work because of figures like AUC without actually measuring things like benefit, net benefit, cost-effective analysis, or other kinds of metrics that are traditionally used in healthcare. And from my perspective, one of the major challenges with the current landscape of ethics guidelines is that none of them actually consider functionality. We tend to jump straight to, concepts of trust or human aligned design or, ethical AI, without actually considering functionality. And that really has to be the first thing that we look at when we're trying to assess the ethics of an AI system. Now, we've seen a good amount of this in the public space, but what about healthcare? Well, one of the papers it's an abstract, but it's really important. This was done by colleagues at Duke University, and what they found was this issue of label leakage during a silent trial. So this idea where the model was training off of information that it wouldn't have had access to in the real world situation. And if they had implemented the model, it would have failed. However, they ran a silent trial, they picked up on this issue, and so they were able to avoid inefficient translation. I've already mentioned the EPIC algorithm. This was a case where, we were all told that this tool was 92% accurate. That was a true claim, but it was based on, retrospective or desktop study. And these folks found out that when you actually try to look at its performance across hospitals, it's quite variable. It does well in some situations, but not so well in others. The United States has recently seen one of the first, I think the first class action lawsuit over this issue where an algorithm was implemented in some of these health settings, was never tested for local accuracy. And clinicians were noting that it was recommending sending home patients who are actually still quite sick. Nonetheless, hospital administrator says, well, the algorithm says send them home, send them home. So a lot of harm occurred to these families. The families are now, they're not suing the manufacturer because the manufacturer did their due diligence. They're actually suing the hospitals that implemented the tool. And they may have some ground because it's the hospital's duty to actually test this tool. Now, many folks might also be familiar with the recent MIT report, which showed that 95% of generative AI implementations are failing to show return on investment, whether that's through economic benefits, whether that's through productivity benefits. And my argument is that it's not necessarily a problem with the technology. I think it's a failure of us in terms of our precision with how we are testing and implementing these tools. So we should all recognize by now that this technical performance, i.e. AUC, in silico is not sufficient to support a belief that a model is going to work. And by that, I mean show benefit in clinical environments. And so really this good technical performance doesn't help us navigate the uncertainty surrounding questions about AI integration. And I'm not suggesting that it's totally useless. It's really important and we need that. However, we need to shift toward prioritizing the right kind of information to help us actually implement things in an efficient and beneficial way. Now, one of the tools we've always had for this is randomized controlled trials. They do provide the most reliable information about whether a specific intervention directly produces benefit under a certain set of conditions. And so this would inevitably be valuable. Um, However, do we always need a randomized controlled trial if tools show so much benefit, or sorry, if tools show so much local variability in performance? One implication is that we might need an RCT at every single site, which seems a bit of a tall ask. And so when we think about whether or not it's appropriate, the question really hinges on whether or not equipoise obtains. And I'll talk a little bit about equipoise. So equipoise has referred to this state of genuine uncertainty about the relative merits of a given intervention relative to the current standard. So if you talk about vaccines, for example, we are justified in exposing people to a new vaccine that we don't know if it works because we are genuinely uncertain as to the relative merits of that versus not having a vaccine. Now, Friedman extended this concept by saying that the relevant state of uncertainty exists within the medical community and not individuals. So it has to be a state within a community of experts. Research ethics committees apply equipoise to determine whether or not a given research endeavor is actually ethical or not, or permissible. And Alex London has recently extended this concept, calling it the integrative approach to equipoise. So he argues that we don't just do trials for trials' sake. We need to generate socially valuable information while safeguarding the welfare of participants. And just to pause here, because equipoise has a colloquial understanding as well. And so just to be clear that it's not an individual's own uncertainty about the merits of a new intervention. It's also not a clinician being 50-50 on a new intervention versus standard of care. And it's also not a gut instinct of what will work or not. Now, this integrative approach to equipoise really prioritizes this idea of socially valuable information. And I think this is important because while we could run RCTs on many different things that we have in medicine, we have to consider whether the burden of doing an RCT is the right paradigm to generate the kind of knowledge that we need. Now, London also argues we have a special concern for basic interests. And so this refers to a situation where we are making sure that we respect individual safety. And we shouldn't be exposing participants to unnecessary risk. So again, not doing an RCT for an RCT's sake, but really thinking about what risk is proportionate to the right information. And he proposes equipoise as this idea of a practical test. So would a reasonable proportion, so not necessarily a majority, but a good proportion of relevant experts find the intervention to have merit? Now, he argues that this is the right point because when you leave it for too long, you can have people having strong opinions in different camps. We see this with things like medication preferences in ICUs. And we also don't want to do it too early because we need to really make sure that something has generated enough evidence already to make people think, yeah, maybe this could actually be better. And so there's sort of this tipping point. Now, a little bit on this point about unnecessary risk, because many people have suggested that AI tools are just alerts. They don't involve, additional risk. However, clinical trials with AI do involve a change to the delivery of care. So there's some uncertainty as to whether that change is a good one or not. And they can change the timing, the type of intervention, the quality, or the character of care. We know from the literature that AI tools carry risks of automation bias. And we've seen that although we felt that explainability would be beneficial in this regard, there's actually a number of studies showing that explainability can worsen automation bias. There's also a risk of unwarranted deviations in clinical practice. Sometimes these are based on gender or race in a clinically unwarranted way, which we would call discrimination. There's the risk of additional burdens on our clinicians, so time, cognitive load, having to learn new technologies, and a resultant research waste. And the risks related to the local suitability of models really can impact on the trustworthiness of an organization as well as our obligations to financial stewardship. We also are increasingly understanding the environmental impact of these models. And so many have suggested that maybe that needs to come into how we're thinking about efficient translation. So, this idea of socially valuable information really comes down to whether or not we think that the information that we learn from the RCT is actually going to make a significant shift to practice. So, if we do an RCT and a strong number of clinicians, upon seeing the results of that, would actually take that up into practice. So we know that whether or not an AI tool is superior to standard of care requires more than just the technical performance alone. We also have to factor in things like workflow integration, minimizing things like alert fatigue. We need to look at human-computer interaction to ensure that we're working efficiently with this tool. And fairness and bias. These can all independently limit the ability of a tool to produce benefit. So, without actually looking at these things a priori, we actually have a high risk of a clinical trial failing and would argue that this is a failure of precise implementation. Um, as I said, there's increasing concern about implementation waste and having to backtrack. So, people taking models offline or putting a bunch of money into a tool that you're now stuck with for a year if you've got a license. And the waste also falls on the clinicians who have had to learn a new technology. So, thinking about equipoise and AI integration, I've argued that technical performance doesn't supply the needed information, but initiating a clinical trial on the basis of technical performance alone would introduce many new and uncertain risks, which we haven't really quantified yet well in the in silico stage. So the next question becomes, what evidence base should the community of experts rely upon to determine whether or not equipoise obtains? And what methods should be used to generate that evidence base? And I would suggest that it's this translational or silent evaluation phase of AI. So Project CANAIRI was a project that has been sitting in my mind for quite a while, ever since I started at Sick Kids back in 2018. And my colleagues there who were in the AI Institute, they were already familiar with this idea of a silent evaluation where you run the model sort of offline in parallel to care, and they would call it things like sanity check. It's just to make sure the model works. And so in thinking about this, I actually think that this stage is critically important. So when we have a stage where we have developed a model that might have good technical performance, but we don't know if a clinical trial is appropriate, and we wouldn't know necessarily how to directly implement. This middle stage allows us to navigate that uncertainty. It allows us to incorporate different things into the design so that we can decide if a clinical trial and what kind is warranted and how to precisely implement. It's a low risk paradigm, which is great for patients, for organizations. And so we've come to this idea of silent trials as the canary in the coal mine. So they are a really great safety signal. So to go a little bit more in depth into a silent trial, what the important thing to stress is that the patient experiences care as usual. So a patient comes to the hospital, they're receiving care, and a copy of that clinical information is sent to a test environment or a research environment. The research team is recording the AI prediction at the intended point in the clinical workflow, which is critically important. The patient experiences care as usual, and we record their outcomes. A copy of that information is sent to the AI team. The AI team then records the outcome, and they can compare to the AI prediction. The patient returns home having experienced standard of care, and what we now know is descriptive evidence of a model's prospective technical performance. We've hit on a number of points that we can't get in the in silico stage, one of them being the prediction coming at the right point within the clinical workflow. So making sure that the information that's available to the model is the stuff that we're training the model on rather than things that come later down the line. We've also compared it to a real world outcome. Now, where this fits in, this came about, this diagram actually was created by Baptiste Fazzi for the Decide AI guidelines. And what you see is this comparison of how we evaluate drugs, surgical innovation stages, and then we have AI in healthcare. So Tripod AI, Stardy AI now are one aspect of this offline validation stage, and then Decide AI comes to early clinical evaluation. So Canary fits in right here. So we incorporate some of the aspects of Tripod and Stardy, but both of those as reporting guidelines are after you've done an evaluation. And what Canary is hoping to do is to provide guidance on how to do this evaluation. And we think this is really important because one of the things that I learned in doing this study back at Sick Kids was that clinicians are looking for a lot more information than is contained in Tripod when they're looking at how they might use AI in clinical care. So we found that they need this really contextualized information that only comes from a local test of the model's suitability. So, for example, we found that there were these three general areas. There's the machine learning model, there's the medical knowledge system and context that clinicians draw from in making decisions. So they'll incorporate what they know about the model to the patient's own context, drawing from their medical knowledge. But some of these some of these areas of overlap. So, for example, model and context, they wanted to know things like, does the model reduce or factor out artifacts? So if you've got a kid in the ICU and you know that you can get these like nefarious looking signals from a diaper change or a cranky child, they want to know, does the model factor those out when it's giving, a clinical deterioration prediction, or are those incorporated? Because that helps them figure out what to do next. If the model has factored them out and they get this alert, that's going to say something to them that maybe they need to act urgently. Whereas if the model doesn't factor those out, they might say, okay, let's first check, is the kid getting a diaper change or not before we actually mobilize, crash cart. So we wanted to look at what practices were people reporting on that would be valuable toward that goal. This turned out to be incredibly complex. So each paper was at minimum triple reviewed. And we sometimes actually had, I think some of them had, maybe 6 or 7 reviewers actually. We wanted to make sure that we were really, really clear on whether it was the right kind of study, whether we had the right information. And we ended up extracting 75 studies. Now, one of the first things that made this really difficult is the terminology that people used. We would see things like prospective, retrospective, silent live implementation study that were really confusing. And so we went through these different types. We came down to this taxonomy that we've proposed here, which is these different types of a silent phase study that people might do. So one is temporal validation or external validation. So this is where they're testing the model's performance over time, but it may or may not align to the clinical workflow or the intended use environment. There were prospective or internal validation studies. So this was sort of a cross-sectional type reassessment of the model's performance on an additional holdout set of the patients for whom it would be used. Then there was the prospective algorithmic validation, which is more or less a traditional silent trial. So this is a live or near live model validation with a separation of that evaluation from clinical care. No changes were made to the patient's experience of care delivery. Then there were prospective clinical validations. So this was a kind of evolution on the silent trial, which was this traditional silent trial, plus they would actually have some means of verifying the model outputs against some ground truth. So one of the most popular forms here is a reader study in diagnostics or in imaging. So this is where you would have the model make predictions of a diagnosis, and you would independently have a clinician or a team of clinicians make diagnoses in parallel, and then you would compare. What we're talking about in terms of a translational trial is something where we take that concept of that modern silent trial, but we also factor in things like, the data and model pipeline, human factors, legal and professional and economic assessments. So what we found in terms of model evaluation, it was still predominantly AUC, less often things like true positives and true negatives, and there weren't often discussions around why the metrics were chosen. So, for example, in some cases, you might want to prioritize having no false positives. In other cases, you might want to prioritize sensitivity, so screening, for example. Some of them conducted clinical verification in some way. So, most commonly, this was against labels that were annotated within the health record. Other times, there was a human verifying the model output, saying, yes, this is correct or not. Other times, there was an independent comparison of the AI performance in reference to some clinical standard. What we found was that not a lot of details were provided on who was doing the evaluation. So sometimes papers would just state a human performed this activity, and we have no idea who the human is. We don't know if they're on the research team, if they're a clinician, if they're a first-year medical student or not. There are very few failure mode evaluations, so looking at cases where the model failed, what kind of cases were they? And this is where radiology really excelled because they would look in these studies, they would look at what were the false positives and what were the false negatives. What were the cases that were missed? What kinds of cases were they? Are they really rare presentations? Was there an issue with the image, how the image was obtained? Was there an issue of fairness? And even fewer fairness evaluations were performed. So in some cases, actually, I think in the majority of cases, it was assumed that either the model was neutral or that, they had done something in the in silico stage to sort of address fairness. There were a handful that said, look, we know there's health inequities, and so we made sure to test against those. One of the most striking conditions that we didn't see fairness testing was in cases of dermatology and imaging. And we know that in dermatology, the accuracy of AI tools can vary quite dramatically depending on your level of skin pigmentation. So it's quite striking not to see some sort of evaluation with respect to something like the Fitzpatrick skin scale. Really interestingly, there were 8 studies that were evaluating a commercially available AI device. So this was where an AI device, a medical device, was either cleared or approved by a regulator, was on the market, and only 4 out of 8 actually reported how it was approved. So CE marking, cleared or approved, or had a class rating associated with it. And there ranged from minor to quite major performance discrepancies compared with the prior published work. So, in many cases, the humans actually outperform the AI system in accuracy. So, in a number of cases, there was a report that led to regulatory approval where the model, did quite well. And they found when they tested it locally, actually, the local clinicians performed better than the AI tool. In other cases, they found that the AI performed worse for certain conditions or certain user groups. And I think this is really critically important because when we're talking about the benefit of AI, we can't necessarily just assume that because it's done well in one place, it's going to do well in another. So again, this issue of precision in local implementation, I think it retains its importance even when you have a regulatory approved medical device. Socio-technical considerations really refers to all of the things outside of the model performance itself. And very often, when they were done, they consisted of this term Hugh Harvey uses called vanity metrics, which more or less is like, do you like the model? Is it helpful? Is it easy to use? And even when they did those, it was usually at the end. and often not included. So actually, when we interviewed people, sometimes they would talk about, oh, we did a little bit of this, sort of at the end. Now, a minority described user engagement either prior to or during the silent trial. So actually, asking patients about their priorities, or asking clinicians about what their workflow looks like. So incorporating those human factors. So, for example, you might want to engage clinicians early so that let's say, if the clinician needs to make the decision at this point, you have to make sure that none of the model inputs are actually only available after that decision point. Some considered calibration or thresholding to mitigate alert fatigue. So things like, how many false positives could you tolerate in order to catch, a case that you really need to catch? So the equivalent of like number needed to treat in pharmacy, they would look at, how many alerts would be acceptable for this to remain effective without kind of teetering into being annoying. They looked at those workflow integration considerations, and then some also reported on the stability of the data flow in the pipeline. So how often were there gaps in data coming into the model? Did the model come offline at any times? Were there updates that had to happen? Because these were all really important in terms of whether clinicians could expect. What they could expect from the model. And going back to that study that we did at Sick Kids, one of the things clinicians wanted to know about is, how often can I run an update? Can I run it every second? Do you run it after the patient has had this lab test, etc.? Some papers described attempts to address automation bias, and so they actually tested their interface design or choices about prediction presentation to end users. So, for example, one team noted that they know that, if you see something in green, we usually interpret green means go or the patient is okay. And they wanted to avoid that connotation because really all it means is the model hasn't detected a problem. Doesn't mean there is not a problem with the patient. So they actually changed the colors of their alert system to avoid that, which they know can exacerbate automation bias. So I thought that was a really thoughtful way of approaching this. We also talked about choices about prediction presentation. So one of the things that is well known within the human factors literature is that, if you give me a 60% metric, I might interpret that differently from, my colleague. 60% might seem really high to one, might seem really low to another. And so having, more categorical outputs is something that people talked about as being human factors related choices. And very few did engage consumers or patients at any point. There were a couple that asked, that were looking down to implementation. And so started talking to patients about, if we could do this, would this be beneficial? What kinds of things would you want to see from this model? And so, from all of this, we really think that this idea of this whole package idea around silent trials is going to help us have more effective translation. And that requires we're looking across a huge domain. And I think this is actually, it's not necessarily specifically unique to AI because it has been talked about in other interventions. But AI really seems to consolidate a lot of this, where we need to be looking at things like change management, factoring in implementation science, navigating regulatory issues, looking at cybersecurity, particularly when we're coming to things like generative AI and agentic AI. All of these things are becoming more critically important than potentially they were for any previous intervention that we've had within medicine. And so we think that this shift is really needed in order to address both these issues of knowing that there's great promise in this technology, but also navigating the fact that we are seeing a lot of implementation waste and we're not necessarily seeing a return on investment, and very limited we're seeing benefit to patients. So, just some overall thoughts that we're taking from the scoping review and the interviews is that transparency and some consolidation of how we're discussing these is really urgently required. And I'm not suggesting that every paper is going to cover everything that we have in here, but what I think would be really beneficial is that, if I run a silent trial here at Women's and Children's on an AI tool, if you at Hawaii are like, hey, that looks really great, we want to see if that will be suitable at our institution, that I've given you the amount of information that you need to make that decision. That's always been the goal of reporting guidelines, things like clinical trial reports. It's to assess that local suitability. And so right now, there's a major gap in reporting on practices that are concerning the most clinically informative aspects of an AI system. That's really where the gap is. We're reporting on a lot of really important technical metrics, but when a clinician is looking at these reports, there's different information that they would like. If we close that gap, that can also help us share accountability because an institution can look at that local performance and give that information to their clinicians through standardized training so that that competency level is raised. And this is relevant even for regulatory approved or cleared medical devices in order to optimize local use. So, if silent trials are fundamentally a mechanism to facilitate ethical translation, then we need to expand the scope of what we're actually evaluating during that silent stage. And so, CANAIRI's key priorities are going to include practical advice for these institutions on meeting that concept. So where do we go from here? We're working on this toolkit for teams that are building or buying AI tools, consideration and incorporation into potential regulation of medical AI. So whether a silent evaluation might become part of the regulatory landscape. We're also looking at building support documents for ethics boards and governance. My experience has been I've had fantastic experiences working with our research ethics committee here, but this is a very new thing for them. And so bringing in some of the technical with the ethical is really important. And we're also working on consumer-focused materials. We've got a really great team of youth who are actually they're graphic designers, and so they're working on designing some of these materials. We've got a great group of consumer partners who are helping us create things like flyers and brochures about what this stage is. So it's a huge list of people to thank. This is a massive, massive effort, and we really wouldn't be anywhere without our colleagues. So a huge thank you to them, particularly to our PhD student lead on this, Humphrey Thompson, to Lana Takamarov, and to the whole Canary steering group. So thank you. Really excited to hear questions, and if you want to participate, that's the link to the survey.